Long before video games captured our imaginations, there was another machine lighting up arcades and challenging players with its mix of skill, strategy, and luck. Pinball, with its clattering bumpers, flashing lights, and satisfying dings, became a cultural icon that bridged generations. But its history is far more complex than the simple thrill of chasing a high score. From its humble beginnings as a tabletop game in 18th century France to its golden age in the mid 20th century, pinball has seen it all: popularity, prohibition, and a resurgence in the digital age. It's a tale of innovation, controversy, and the enduring magic of a silver ball dancing across a field of flippers. Today, we're tracing the fascinating journey of pinball, its origins, its battles against bans, and its evolution into a beloved pastime and a digital phenomenon. So load up your quarters, pull the plunger, and join us for a tilt-free trip down memory card lane. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope these words find you well. Hello, and welcome to the 230th episode of our Video Game History Podcast, A Trip Down Memory Card Lane. Each week, we'll tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game or the people who have created it. It can be about a console or the technology that brought it to life. We often talk about the companies that bring it all together, making our hobby video games a reality. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the game, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. Today, we are stepping back in time to explore the fascinating history of pinball, a game that began as a parlor amusement and eventually evolved into a cultural icon. From its early origins to its battle against prohibition and the rise of its arcade glory days, pinball's journey is a story of innovation and resilience. I'm David Casson, and as always, I'm joined by my co host, who probably has got his own high score story to tell. He's my brother, Rob Casson. Rob, what's your best memory of playing pinball?
Well, I remember playing it.
Okay. That's
No, I mean, back in school, I used to always play the Spaceball pinball.
on the
That was
on
fun.
the computer,
Oh, yeah.
the virtual pinball.
Yep, absolutely. Played the hell out of that.
So, like you said, you remember playing pinball.
Yep.
Well,
I'm sure I mean, I probably played on a machine here and there, but none that were as memorable as that.
I guess there is no better memory than playing pinball than of a memory playing pinball.
Exactly. See? You're getting there.
Well, today we are going to learn all about its history, its origins, some of the struggles that it found itself as an industry in throughout the years, and where it's at now. But before we get into that long history, why don't you share with our listeners what else has happened during this current week in gaming history?
Kicking it off on January 21st, 1994, 31 years ago this week, Wario Land Super Mario Land 3 was released for the Game Boy in Japan, marking the first game to feature Wario as the protagonist. Developed by Nintendo, the game departed from the traditional Mario formula, introducing Wario's unique abilities, such as his shoulder bash and penchant for greed, as players collect treasures to fund his quest for a castle. Wario Land blended platforming with puzzle elements, offering multiple endings based on how much treasure the player amassed. Praised for its inventive mechanics and charming humor, the game established Wario as a standout character and launched a successful spin off series, cementing its legacy as a classic in Nintendo's handheld library. How was it, Dave?
How was Wario Land?
Yeah.
It was fantastic. We had that Game Boy. We had the three Super Mario Lands. They were special. Wario was a very unique character. Kind of left you going, huh? This ain't Mario. And then you learn to love him.
Oh, absolutely. Him and all his gassiness.
Him and all his gassiness, for sure.
Next up, we have on January 21st, 1998, Resident Evil 2 released for the PlayStation in North America, setting a new benchmark for survival horror gaming. Developed by Capcom, the game expanded on the foundations of the original Resident Evil, introducing players to the zombie infested Raccoon City and intertwining the stories of rookie cop Leon S. Kennedy and college student Claire Redfield. With improved graphics, more dynamic environments, and a dual scenario system offering unique perspectives, Resident Evil 2 delivered a deeper, more immersive experience. When it was released 27 years ago this week, it was praised for its atmospheric design, gripping narrative, and tense gameplay, leading the game to become a critical and commercial success, solidifying the Resident Evil series as a defining franchise in gaming history. We covered this history back in episode 125, so if you want to learn more, check it out.
It was almost the end of the series.
Almost, but it wasn't.
Almost. No, it definitely wasn't, as we learned by subsequent releases on our episode last week on Resident Evil 4.
And, the 7 and 8, and, they're probably working on 9 now, and
I hope so. Village was actually a good one.
actually, they're all pretty damn good.
Yeah.
In this major number series. I don't know about the offshoots.
Facts.
Next up, on January 21st, 1999, Super Smash Bros. Released for the Nintendo 64 in Japan, introducing a groundbreaking crossover fighting game that brought together iconic Nintendo characters like Mario, Link, Pikachu, and Donkey Kong. Developed by HAL Laboratory and defected by Masahiro Sukurai, the game offered a fresh take on the fighting genre, focusing on knocking opponents out of the arena rather than depleting health bars. Its unique mechanics, accessible controls, and chaotic multiplayer gameplay made it an instant hit. Super Smash Bros. Laid the foundation for one of Nintendo's most beloved franchises, paving the way for future entries that would expand its roster and cement its place as a staple of competitive and party gaming. We talked about it back in episode 35, so if you want to learn more, go listen.
Go listen to episode 35. Long time ago.
Oh, yes, almost 200 episodes.
I know. Isn't that crazy to think about?
Almost 4 whole years. Womp womp.
Almost.
Next up, 21 years ago this week on January 20th, 2004, when Nintendo officially announced the Nintendo DS, a revolutionary handheld console that would redefine portable gaming. Featuring dual screens, one being a touchscreen, the DS introduced a new way to interact with games, offering innovative gameplay possibilities. The device also included a built in microphone and wireless connectivity, enabling multiplayer experiences and voice input. This announcement marked the beginning of a new era for Nintendo, as the DS went on to become one of the best selling consoles of all time, with iconic titles like Brain Age, Mario Kart DS, and Pokemon Diamond and Pearl showcasing its versatility. The DS's unique features set a new standard for handheld gaming and solidified Nintendo's dominance in the portable gaming market.
DS is a fantastic platform, frankly.
I agree. I still enjoy pulling the 3DS out now and then again, but the DS was the start of it, and it's finally old enough to drink.
It is finally old enough to drink, yes. Yeah, it was that was a good innovation, and it was a step in the right direction towards what we have now, which is a Switch, admittedly.
Yeah, very true.
That's Nintendo has kind of converged their console and handheld offerings into one, which is very unique, and I think it's done very well for them. So
Yeah, PlayStation's trying to step in that game too with the PlayStation Portable, though.
yeah, they're all trying to
So
jump in there.
they see what Nintendo saw a long time ago. Just you know, Nintendo's got the jump. Last up for this week in gaming history on January 22nd, 2007, Hotel Dusk Room 215 was released for the Nintendo DS, delivering a unique blend of interactive storytelling and puzzle solving. Developed by Sing, the game followed former detective Kyle Hyde as he unraveled the mysteries of a mysterious hotel filled with intriguing characters and hidden secrets. With its distinctive hand drawn art style, which mimics sketchbook illustrations, and the DS's touchscreen used to navigate and interact with the environment, Hotel Dusk offered an immersive and novel gameplay experience. Praised for its engaging narrative, atmospheric presentation, and innovative use of the DS hardware, the game became a cult classic and a standout title in the visual novel and adventure game genres.
That was a fantastic. Did you ever play Hotel Dusk?
I did not.
I remember it was rare when I bought it. Like I had to find it online type deal, and I don't remember how I heard about it, but it was something unique and new, and everyone was like, "You got to play it," and so I did. It was fantastic, and I just realized now in hindsight, cool story, bro.
Yep, you beat me to it.
Oh my god, like I don't really have much to say about it. I mean that didn't just say it was a really good like almost interactive novel that had a lot of great like puzzles and just good atmosphere. It was fantastic. All right, Rob. Well, have you ever played bocce ball before?
I can't say I have.
You ever played any of the lawn games where the whole goal is to like throw rocks or stones or balls, on the grass at all?
I have played croquet
Croquet's good. It,
and golf.
croquet and golf are where we're going. Bocce ball is kind of the beginning. Bocce ball, for those of you who don't know, is basically a game you play on grass where you throw stones to see who can get the closest to a specific target. And it was these type of lawn games that kind of gave way to ground billiard games that were played similarly by hitting sticks towards, well, targets the same way. And Rob, those ground billiard games that would hit with sticks would eventually evolve into croquet and golf. So you're somewhere in the spectrum of our history today. With that being said, we know from our own hobby that we're speaking here today that not everyone wants to spend all their time outside, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
The summers, they be summering, the winters be wintering. Speaking of which, it snowed in Louisiana today. First time, actually, most snow we've gotten since like 1895.
Wow,
Yeah, pretty crazy.
that is pretty crazy. It's a long time.
And so the ground billiard games kind of gave way to indoor billiards. The best version of which I would argue nowadays we know is pool, which is pocket billiards. We first see billiards sometime in 15th century Europe with the first known indoor billiard table being owned by King Louis XI, who reigned over France from 1461 to 1483. And it was a few hundred years later, during the reign of Louis the 14th, famously known as the Sun King, the one who built Versailles, and they have all the TV shows and stuff around that nowadays. Sun King is probably the most famous of all the old French kings. It was during his reign that we took the next step towards where we're going today, which is modern pinball. During the Sun King's reign from 1643 to 1715, the billiard tables were narrowed and wooden pins were added to one side of the table. And on the other side of the table, players stood and they shot the ball at the pins with a stick or cue, like a pool cue. And it was a game that looked very much like a tabletop version of bowling as well as a tabletop version of billiards, right?
Okay.
But the pins took too long to reset, right? You knock all the pins down, someone's got to put them up. They're little wooden pins. So eventually they were fixed to the table and holes were added to the table to become the target, which required much less time and setup. Rules were added to the game by which players could ricochet off the pins to achieve higher scoring holes. So eventually it kind of evolved. I don't know, closer to, on one hand that's kind of like pool with pins, and on the other hand you can kind of see where pinball is kind of shaping up, right?
Yeah, it's making sense.
Right. In 1777, a party was thrown in honor of Louis and his queen Marie Antoinette at the Chateau de Bagatelle. And the highlight of said party was a new table billiards game. It featured a slender table, it featured cue sticks, and players would use those cue sticks to shoot ivory balls up an inclined playfield. Now, this game was coined Bagatelle by the king's brother because the party took place at the Chateau de Bagatelle, and afterwards, Bagatelle became a popular pastime throughout France. During the same time period, somewhere between the 1750s and the 1770s, in Western Europe, Germany, France, in that general area, a version of Bagatelle named Japanese billiards was invented. Billiard japonais, as it's called, used thin metal pins, and they replaced the cue with a coiled spring and plunger. About 100 years later, on May 30th, 1871, a British inventor that had immigrated to the United States filed patent number 1115 357, and it was called Improvements in Bagatelle. This patent was similar to Japanese billiards in that it used metal pins and a plunger, but what it also did was shrink these giant billiard tables enough to literally fit on a tabletop, and other it added other improvements to like playfield bells. Now this patent was filed by a man named Montague Redgrave, and for many, Montague's patent is kind of where modern pinball really begins to take shape. Between 1873 and 1875, Redgrave operated in Chicago, making these bagatelle games for homes and taverns as the company Redgrave and Wilson. He then moved to New Jersey and he began building these home bagatelle machines there. Now, this was just shortly after the invention of the world's first fully automatic vending machine, which dispensed stamps, if you must know, and that first appeared in 1867. And throughout the 1880s, vending machines that dispensed envelopes, postcards, and notepaper began to pop up around railway stations and post offices in London. And so it was in 1888 that the first vending machines came to the United States. They were installed on elevated subway platforms in New York, and they sold Tutti Frutti gum to passersby. You ever have Tutti Frutti gum?
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, it was good, actually. I like Tutti Frutti gum. It wasn't long between these automated coin operated machines were used for entertainment purposes. At first, the coin operated machines were fortune telling machines and strength testing machines. Some of them were what we call mutoscopes, which is basically where you pop a coin in the machine and you have a little viewer, like a viewmaster, that you would put your eyes up to, and it would show you basically a photograph. And these all were placed in what became commonly known as penny arcades because they were commonly cost a penny at the time. For the next couple of decades, these two concepts, coin operated amusement and bagatelle machines, would slowly kind of come together and evolve out of necessity. The birth of the film industry in the 1910s and 1920s caused the popularity of the penny arcades to wane. So the industry was forced to come up with new coin operated machines to try to get new people back into the arcades, right? And this is essentially what led to the birth of the modern arcade machines as we know it. And in this period of innovation, pinball games are front and center. You know, this is the time when skee ball was invented, for instance. These games of skill that typically were at carnivals were turned into coin operated games and brought into the penny arcades. And pin games, such as Bagatelle, were brought into the mix too. In 1892, Charles Young out of York, Pennsylvania, patented the coin game board, which was a tabletop bagatelle game that had an inclined playfield covered in pins. It was also enclosed in glass. It had a spring loaded plunger and it had a coin slot. As far as we know, the coin game board is the first coin operated bagatelle game. So we're here in 1892. And from there, the concept began to spread. One popular game that was invented during this time was called Log Cabin. And Log Cabin was a bagatelle game made by the Cali brothers of Detroit. Log Cabin brought gambling into the mix, so to speak, as it was a table. Rob, we would kind of. Do you know what a pachinko board is? You ever watch The Price is Right and see the pachinko board?
Yeah, I have.
Log Cabin is more like a miniature pachinko board. It had the spring plunger. There was a bunch of pins, laid out. The ball would get sprung up, and it would fall into one of 13 slots on the bottom. And each one of those 13 slots would correspond to a different prize that the players could win. Six of them were said to be empty, and between the other seven, players could win between 10 and 50 cents. There was also a hole near the top center that was worth a whole dollar for anyone that would manage to land it there. So basically, players would play a nickel. When it came out, it was a nickel a ball, and they would hope to win something from it. So it was more akin to gambling, in that sense, than the traditional pinball game that we think of today. By the way, if any of you are interested in seeing any of the games that we're going to talk about today, go ahead and check out the show notes on our website. We say it every week, www.memorycardlane.com. There are photos of pretty much everything from Redgrave's 1871 patent onward. There's examples prior to that too. There's pictures of most everything we're talking about, from the Japanese billiards tables all the way to the modern. And I linked to all of them in the show notes. I love getting to see all these old arcade machines. This early coin op era had a lot of innovation to it. It's super cool to see them. Super cool that they still exist in a form that we can see them from 1871.
Mm-hmm.
So
Definitely.
the show notes will be on our website. Check it out. Sometimes towards the end of 1930, a carpenter from Youngstown, Ohio, by the name of Arthur Paulin, built a modified bagatelle table as a Christmas present for his daughter. She absolutely loved it. It was popular in the house, so he took it into town, and he put it on the counter of a radio shop owned by his friend Merle Parle. And Merle loved it too, and Merle suggested adding a coin slot to it. Well, that message was well received, and they adopted another friend, Earl Froome, and the three of them, Paulin, Parle, and Froome, get teamed up, so to speak, and they successfully worked out how to attach a coin slot to the game. They left it on the counter at the radio shop, and after its first hour, they opened the machine and found $2.60 in nickels. And that's crazy, right? A
That
nickel at a
yeah, that's pretty
time
crazy.
in an hour. So they knew it was going to be successful. They knew they could make money. So, emboldened by their success, the three men decided to build more of those machines. They formed their own company, which was called Automatic Industries, and they began producing a similar game called Wiffle. By the end of 1931, they had built 31,000 Wiffle units, and it was clear that there was a demand for these types of games throughout the nation. Now, there were other games that saw popularity during this period alongside Wiffle. There was a similar table called the Whoopee game, but one of the factors that prevented more widespread success of these early bagatelle tables was their cost. They could run anywhere between $100 and $200, which was a lot of money in 1931. And so, really, it was when inventors figured out how to reduce the cost of manufacturing these machines that really allowed the industry to flourish and kind of shape into pinball as we know it today. In 1930, the Bingo Novelty Company released another table called Bingo, and it eventually found its way to another man named David Gottlieb. And Gottlieb improved upon the design of Bingo, and he released the improved version as Baffle Ball in 1931, managing to sell it for only $17.50 a piece. Way different than $200, right?
A little bit, yeah.
And this was pretty revolutionary because it allowed people who didn't have a lot of money to purchase it and make money off of it. People that were down on their luck, people that came from nothing, it made it more accessible to the common man. Baffle Ball eventually sold over 50,000 units, which made Gottlieb the first major manufacturer of pinball games. During this period, one of Gottlieb's distributors, Raymond Maloney, expressed frustration in not being able to obtain enough Baffle Ball units for his customers. It's said at one time that Gottlieb was making about 400 of these Baffle Balls a day, and it wasn't enough to meet demand, which is nuts. So Maloney is one of his distributors and isn't happy that he can't get enough Baffle Ball units. And so he decides to form his own company. He founds a company called Lion Manufacturing. And he begins to produce a similar game that he designed called Ballyhoo, which was named after a satirical magazine at the time. Its design changes that included a larger play field and more pockets for the ball to go into. This all won people over, and Ballyhoo became a smash hit, hitting the same 50,000 mark in just 7 months. Eventually, Mooney changed the name of Lion Manufacturing. He adopted the name of his successful game, and with that, Bally was born. Now, Gottlieb and Bally were among 150 companies that were producing pinball machines by the end of 1932, as the industry as we know it really began to take shape. It was, with that being said, a super competitive market, and by 1934, only 14 of those companies remained. Among those 14 was a company called Pacific Amusements, who in 1933 produced an electrified pinball table called Contact. And although Contact wasn't necessarily the first electrified pinball table, it brought ideas from many other tables together to create an absolute success. It had a powered solenoid that propelled the ball out of a bonus hole in the middle of the play field. It had solenoids that rang bells to reward its players. They just had all the bells and whistles, so to speak, that made it super appealing to other people. Now, the man who worked for Pacific Amusements and designed Contact was Harry Williams. And Harry Williams went on to form his own company called Williams Manufacturing in 1944. And yes, that's the same Williams that we've talked about before. They would eventually be responsible for arcade hits that we've covered, such as Defender, as eventually they got into arcade games and did really, really well at it while it was in its heyday. Now, during this period, the industry quickly adopted electrification. The solenoids, the bells, the whistles, lights to attract players quickly became the standard for all pinball games. And of course, we know shortly after the mid 40s, or in the mid 40s, the United States was kind of pushed into World War II, right? And during World War II, pretty much all the manufacturing across the nation turned to the war effort. I mean, it didn't matter what industry you were in. If you were making things, you were making things for World War II. And that was no different for the pinball industry. So they turn to manufacturing different things for the war effort. And as they're doing that on the side, in order to keep the pinball industry alive, there are a few companies like Williams, for instance, that would buy their old tables from operators because they didn't have the materials to make new ones anymore. And they refurbished some of their old tables with patriotic artwork, because that was the theme for the time. And as the industry moved through this period, as they're refurbishing these tables, there are still a few hobbyists and innovators that were making improvements. This is the time period where we saw tilt sensing mechanisms brought into the play. The first game to add player controlled flippers to keep the ball in play longer was a game called Humpty Dumpty that was released by Gottlieb in 1947. And Rob, wouldn't you know it, when the first pinball tables included flippers, the flippers actually faced outwards and not inwards.
What?
I know, isn't that weird to think about?
So they were in the center and faced out, is what you're saying?
Or on the ends and faced out. I didn't look that closely. We'll have to look at that table. It wasn't until 1950 that when Gottlieb produced Just 21, that Just 21 was the first game to feature dual inward facing flippers, the kind that we still know pinball machines to have today. And frankly, flippers became the innovation that saved an industry that had found itself under widespread scrutiny for quite some time, which we'll cover in just a moment. Rob, as we dive into the fascinating evolution of pinball from bagatelle tables to electrified marbles, it's incredible to see how ingenuity and creativity transformed a simple game into something iconic.
It really is. It's like every step was a new level up, combining old ideas with new technology to create something unforgettable. Kind of like building your own podcast.
Exactly. Speaking of which, if you've ever wanted to take your passion and share it with the world, Zencaster makes it easier than ever to start your own podcast.
I've heard of Zencaster, but isn't podcasting a huge commitment? What if I'm not tech savvy?
Well, that's the best part. Zencaster is an all in one platform that takes care of the tech for you. You can record high quality audio and video right from your browser. There's no complicated setups or expensive equipment needed. It's as smooth as hitting a jackpot on a pinball machine.
Well, that sounds simple, but what about the editing? I've heard that can be tricky.
Now with Zencaster, their post-production tools automatically clean up your audio, removing background noise, balancing levels, and even trimming out awkward silences or filler words like or It's like having your own digital pinball wizard working behind the scenes.
Okay, but once I have it all ready, how do I get it out for people to listen?
Zencaster has you covered there too. You can distribute your podcast directly to major platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more, all from the Zencaster site. It's the easiest way to share your passion with the world.
All right, you sold me. But how can our listeners get started?
It's simple. Head over to zencaster.com/pricing and use our offer code, all one word, memory card lane, and you can get 30% off the first month of any Zencaster paid plan. Whether you're just starting out or looking to take your podcast to the next level, Zencaster makes it easy to sound professional.
That's an awesome deal. Listeners, if you've ever thought about starting your own podcast, now's the time to make it happen.
Absolutely. Head to zencaster.com/pricing and again, use our offer code, one word, memory card lane, and let your creativity shine, just like the flashing lights on a classic pinball machine.
And with that, let's get back to the story of how pinball became the cornerstone of arcades everywhere.
If you'll recall, ever since the beginning with Log Cabin, there were pin games through which players could win prizes. Before the flipper, pinball games were largely ones of chance, right? Where players pop money into a machine, hit the ball with the thing, and it would go through the pins and in a hole, and they would earn money and prizes at some places, right? Some machines, that prize was a free game. Some locations allowed players to win prizes like gum. Others had Chinaware. Jewelry was said to be given away at some places of chance. It was very much a game of chance that players gambled their money away on, right?
Right.
And gambling is commonly associated with a corruption of morals. So, of course, conservative, religious, and family oriented groups would speak out against such vices. And on top of that, the center of the pinball industry was Chicago, which, thanks to all the organized crime that emerged during the Great Depression, Al Capone and the Mafia, Chicago had an image of being a lawless town that no good person should live in, and that was the birthplace of pinball, right? That was the center of pinball.
Right.
So pinball really had this like shady connotation. One person who saw pinball as a breeding ground for crime and juvenile delinquency was New York City Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. LaGuardia felt that the pinball industry took millions of dollars a year from the pockets of school children in the form of nickels and dimes given to them as their lunch money. And so, what started as just a crusade against illegal slot machines soon was also focused on pinball machines, which LaGuardia famously called insidious nickel stealers. I kind of like that as a name for pinball machines.
That is,
Insidious
yeah,
nickel
quite the word.
stealers.
That's quite the word
So,
name.
in the wake of the bombing on Pearl Harbor, as we just talked about, it catapulted the United States into World War II. And LaGuardia and others used that opportunity, the fact that United States was now focused on wartime efforts, to increase their efforts to paint things that didn't contribute to it, including pinball, in a negative light. So pinball was marked as a waste of materials. And the LaGuardia believed that it was, quote, infinitely preferable that the metal in these evil contraptions be manufactured into arms and bullets which can be used to destroy our foreign enemies. So basically, he said, we don't need pinball machines, but we do need bullets, right?
I mean, hey, sometimes you just know what you need.
Yes. And so, with the weight of the war effort behind him, LaGuardia was able to get the New York City Council to ban pinball machines in public spaces on January 21st, 1942, which is actually 83 years ago today, the day we're recording this, which is why we're discussing it here today. For once, it's not the invention of pinball because we can't narrow that down to a day. It is kind of something that evolved. There's various pinball historians. As a side note, they can't even really narrow it down. Like this was the first pinball table, right? We don't have that. We have like this was the first coin operated bagatelle table, and we have this was the first major manufacturer of these bagatelle slash pinball machines, but there isn't like one that they point at and they're like that's the first pinball machine, because there was 142 companies all doing the same thing at the same time, and we really didn't have release dates the way we have now, you know what I mean?
Right.
So we kind of know how we know who the major players were, and we know how the industry evolved, but we really don't know the beginning, just kind of how it worked its way through history. But we do know, now that we're coming back to it, that in January 21st, 1942, the New York City Council banned pinball machines in public spaces. And in the days, weeks, and months that followed, he had the police raid candy stores, bowling alleys, bars, and amusement centers. Now, there's a History Channel article that I linked to in the show notes that tells us of one incident where on March 6, 1948, a New York City patrolman in plain clothes entered a cigar store on 106th Street in East Harlem, and he dropped a penny into a machine called the Marvel Pop-Up. It says he pulled back the game's plunger and he launched a steel ball into play. The silver orb danced around the tabletop board as the undercover policeman tried to keep it in play. His first 5 shots ended in frustration, but his sixth try proved lucky as the metallic pellet landed in a hole that won him a free play. Having finally made his shot, the patrolman placed the cigar store's owner into handcuffs and arrested him for unlawful possession of a gambling machine.
Wow.
Free play. That's gambling. You're winning something.
I mean, yeah. That's
It's funny because that was an innovation. Like, that's an innovation in the industry that happened, and that is something that threatened the industry.
right. Definitely.
In through events like this, the police confiscated around 2,000 machines. Reportedly, that's about a whole fifth, 1/5 of the city's count, because they banned it in public spaces, right? They can't ban it in private spaces, but they can ban it in public spaces. So you can't have it in the corner store or bars or arcades or anything that the public has access to, basically, is what it is. Taking a page out of Prohibition, LaGuardia and the other police officers gathered the press, and in front of the press, in a little show of force, they smashed these 2,000 pinball machines to bits with sledgehammers. What remained afterwards, the pieces, were loaded into garbage barges and dumped into the Long Island Sound,
What's that?
body of water around New York.
So they dumped it into water.
They dumped it into the
Wow.
other cities such as Chicago, Milwaukee, New Orleans, and Los Angeles. They followed New York's lead, and they also banned pinball. And while there were plenty of places that didn't go to such extreme measures, for instance, it said that Chicago's ban wasn't ever really enforced. No surprise, since it was the industry. It did leave pinball with a negative reputation that persisted for decades, frankly. And this is part of pinball's history that you don't really hear about. In fact, during the 1960 presidential election, Republicans tried to smear Democratic candidate John F. Kennedy by releasing a group photograph that included him with a silent partner in an Indiana pinball operation. Isn't that crazy?
That's pretty freaking crazy.
I mean, they tried to smear John Kennedy with a freaking pin, just by being associated with a guy who owned a pinball operation.
That's, yeah.
In,
Wow.
in 1971, the district attorney of Orleans Parish, the county, if you're not from Louisiana, that's the county in which New Orleans resides. The district attorney of Orleans Parish was indicted for accepting bribes to protect illegal pinball gambling in New Orleans. It was a crime that he was eventually found not guilty of committing. So, throughout the 50s and 60s, pinball basically is associated with gambling in most, not all, but a lot of major cities, your biggest cities, no less. And it didn't thrive. It became an underground. It very much became an underground thing, an underground culture, and that is how it survived. Was as an underground pastime. It wasn't until the 1970s that pinball gained widespread acceptance again. In 1974, the California Supreme Court ruled that pinball was more of a game of skill than a game of chance, and it overturned its prohibition in Los Angeles. A few years later, in 1976, New York's famous prohibition was put to the test as its city council considered a measure to overturn the ban that still existed for movie theaters, bars, and similar establishments at that point. What had happened was, I love that phrase, the city was on the brink of bankruptcy and they were looking to overturn the ban and require a licensing fee in order to bring in increased revenue. But there were many people that were still holding on to its gambling connotations. So, in order to prove that pinball was a game of skill and not one of chance, the AMOA, or Amusement Music Operators Association, brought in one of the top pinball players in the country, a man by the name of Roger Sharp, to demonstrate his pinball skills in a Manhattan courtroom for the council. And as it was later told, they watched as Sharp uh, called out his shots. Sharp himself said he was like Babe Ruth. If I pull the plunger back this far, the ball's going to go right here. I can flip the ball right into here. And like he called it, he pulled the thing back. The ball went right where it was supposed to. And the city council finally voted to overturn the ban. The 1970s was a good time for the pinball industry. As we've learned through other episodes, that is when microprocessors were introduced to the world, and microprocessors brought pinball into the realm of electronic gaming. The first pinball machine to use a microprocessor was a prototype made by Bally called Flicker in 1974. And using what they learned from Flicker, they made a microprocessor board that they put in 8 different machines. The one of which came out in 1977. It was a pinball table called 8 Ball, and 8 Ball was the pinball machine that held all the sales records from 1977 to 1983. Realistically, and we've talked about it time and time again, the golden age of arcades, which lasted from the late 70s to the early 80s, it ended any dominance that pinball machines had in arcades. All those pinball tables were replaced by the Pac-Man, Space Invaders, and the Defender cabinets of the world, you know? Video games cost less in a lot of cases. They're not mechanical, so they basically make more money while requiring less maintenance. And so video arcade cabinets were more popular than pinball machines were. You know, companies that had been got their start with pinball, like Williams, Gottlieb, Bally, they all transitioned over to video games in order to stay profitable. And while the industry was in decline, we now had the invention of solid state technology that was still leading to innovations that were being thought up as a way of bringing back players to the pinball tables. Now, we've discussed some of these innovations in other episodes. I know we talked about Eugene Jarvis, who made the arcade cabinet Defender, and his early history is as a pinball table designer. And so we talked about some of these innovations on the episode on Defender. For instance, they made at Williams Gorgar, which introduced synthesized speech to pinball. Other Williams machines added other innovations. Space Shuttle brought ramps for the ball to travel around. Williams Firepower brought multi ball. And then other companies innovated too. Gottlieb had Black Hole, which brought multi level games, you know, ramps that would take it up and down a level. And blinking chase lights came courtesy of Bally Xenon. With these innovations, pinball never really saw the success that it previously had. You know, all these innovations are probably more recognized by modern audiences because they're all things that are standard in pinball machines nowadays. But even with the innovations, you know, they never saw the success they had before. The 90s did bring a slight increase in interest into pinball machines. Throughout the 90s, Williams dominated the industry. They had complicated devices, mechanical devices. They had more elaborate displays. They had more elaborate sound systems. They kept upping the ante to attract new players to pinball machines. And it was during that period that they started to license pop culture icons, you know, movie stars, movie shows, television shows, other icons like music stars. All these icons were licensed to make tables around them, and that would also bring new players into to the pinball tables, right?
Right.
But these innovations were short lived. As a result of an industry downturn in the mid 90s, you know, companies merged, companies were sold off, and many closed. By 1997, Rob, there were realistically only two companies that were left producing pinball machines, physical pinball machines, and they were Sega Pinball and Williams. In 1999, Sega sold its pinball division to the division president, a man named Gary Stein, who renamed it Stein Pinball. So you had Stein Pinball and you had Williams. And then in October of 1999, Williams exited the pinball business to focus on casino equipment, which made Stern Pinball the only manufacturer producing original pinball machines for years and years and years. In fact, another company from 2001 to 2013, only Stern was producing original pinball machines. It wasn't until 2013 when a new company named Jersey Jack Pinball released a Wizard of Oz pinball table that someone else than Stern finally made a pinball table. So for 12 years, only one company was doing it.
Damn.
Isn't that crazy to think of?
That is
I
really
mean,
crazy.
we don't think about it, right? We go to these arcades, we see pinball tables, and you don't think about that in any way, shape, or form.
No, not at all.
But for 12 years, there was only Stern Pinball making machines. Literally one company making machines everywhere across the world, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, that's insane.
The Wizard of Oz pinball table was the first pinball machine manufactured in the U.S. with an LCD in its back box. That's the back screen. It was the first wide body pinball machine produced since 1994, and like I said, first pinball machine made by someone other than Stern in 2001. And as we went into the 2000s, a bunch of independent pinball manufacturers began to pop up that helped keep the industry alive alongside Stern. So we still get to see new pinball machines, one or two here and there as the years go on. In 2023, A company called Barrels of Fun released its first pinball table based on Jim Henson's Labyrinth. And just last year, Stern Pinball produced 3 new tables, one on Jaws, one on John Wick, and there's a new Uncanny X-Men table. So for the moment, all of these pinball enthusiasts are keeping the physical industry alive. I would like to add briefly that simulating a pinball machine in video games, Rob, since you talked about that when we started our conversation, has been done since the early years of the video game industry, even before there were microprocessors. In 1973, one of the early pinball manufacturers that we didn't talk about today, called Chicago Coin, released a cabinet called TV Pin Game, which was pinball simulated on a screen. Midway responded with their own virtual pinball game TV Flipper, and Atari got into the mix. They have a game called Pin Pong in 1974, and these are all pinball games that are shown on an arcade screen. And as home gaming gained popularity, virtual pinball moved over to it. The 1990s saw games like you had mentioned, Pinball Dreams, Pro Pinball, and 3D Ultra Pinball. 3D Ultra Pinball was included with Windows 2000 and Windows XP. I think your space game was part of 3D Ultra Pinball.
It was, yeah.
And more recently, we've seen the Pinball FX series take the helm. Uh, Pinball FX, available on Steam. It's free to play for starters. I went and checked it out while doing my research for this episode. It's essentially a platform in which you can, there's a few free ones, but there are also many different virtual pinball tables, 130 to be exact at this moment, that you can purchase and play on Pinball FX. And you can also compete against other people for high scores. There are leaderboards, but there's also matchups where you can select matchup and you can compete for the high score at the same time. So virtual pinball is still a thing. Physical pinball is still a thing. That has come a long, long way since, I would argue, that Bagatelle table in 1871. I think that when pinball was shrunk to a tabletop and the pins and the bells and everything were added to it and the coin slot, I think that's kind of, well, coin slot would have been 1930, but I think 1871 is kind of when modern pinball started to take shape for me. But it's come a long way since then. Heck, it's come a long way since 1930, to be fair, right? So
Oh, yeah. It's just all come a long way.
and that is the long, sordid history of pinball with its ups and downs. Uh, a game that many people enjoy, and all pun intended, it caused many people to get majorly tilted. Wah, wah, wah.
Good joke, Dave.
Thanks. I just thought of it on the fly. We've talked about a lot of other games today. For instance, we talked about Eugene Jarvis and Defender, who worked for Williams, which was part of the story today. And as always, if you'd like to learn more about all these other satellite stories around this one, we have lots of other episodes, 229 other episodes to be exact, for you to check out. And of course, if you'd like to check out any of our old episodes, you can always find them anywhere you get your podcasts, like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. But if you'd like to check out the notes and see pictures of these, or another place you can check out the old episodes is our website, www.memorycardlane.com. Rob, what else can people do on our website?
You can find a calendar of our upcoming episode topics. You can find links to our Discord where you can come talk about some of the episode topics with Dave and I. Link to our Patreon where you can help support us, get access to ad-free and unedited versions of our episodes. And you can find links to our social medias where I am on several platforms as Rob_O_Raptor and Dave.
I can be found on various platforms as David is wrong. Each week, ladies and gent, we tell you one story that I've deemed relevant to this week in gaming history. It can be about a game, a console, a technology, a person. I just find one topic that somehow ties into the week of this podcast publication date, and I roll with it. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or maybe what it gave back to the world as its legacy. Today, we walked you through the long history of pinball, from its ancestral roots as a tabletop billiards game to the modern era where we're playing pinball against other people online. One of the best things about this podcast, frankly, is every week when I sit down to do my research for a new episode, I get super excited when I learn something new. And I get excited because I learned something new, and I know excitedly that I get to teach other people new things. And that's my favorite part about doing this. It's this beautiful cycle of teaching and learning and learning and teaching. And in celebration of that cycle, we like to go round table, which is really just, the two of us sitting across from one another, so to speak, and talk about what we've learned today. So, Rob, tell me what you've learned today.
Well, I learned that there was a whole illegal pinball racket
Mm-hmm.
that I never really considered legality of pinball machines, and it's kind of interesting to know that that was actually such a big deal and that they were outlawed in public places and destroyed. And it's you think like prohibition, like everyone knows about that, like drugs bad, but like pinball machines bad, just
Right?
weird. So that's pretty neat to learn. I didn't never knew about that. So that's my takeaway. How about yours, Dave?
The history of pinball fascinates me. The banning of it is a very fascinating moment in history, and frankly, because that's our the date 83 years ago today is the reason why I picked this topic. It's something I didn't know, and so when I stumbled across it, I was very excited to tell the story of the banning specifically, and that evolved into the whole history of pinball. But I will tell you, I think what I find most interesting about this is how it evolved. The early pinball really evolved alongside vending machines and coin operated amusement, right? With the ski balls and the strength testers and the little machines you pop in the penny arcades, what we call like God, I can't think of the name of it. Where you pop the penny in and figures on the thing would do things kind of thing, like these scene ones. So it's just really neat. It's really neat to see how everything kind of evolved because there's always an argument that this isn't a video game topic. Let's be honest about that because pinballs or coin operated, mostly mechanical. I mean, in the 1970s, when pinball gained microprocessors, you could make a stronger argument that that it's more akin to video games. But realistically, this is coin operated mechanical games, electromechanical games, and not so much a video game in the traditional sense. And so this stuff we don't really get to look at very often, right? Um,
Right.
and so because of it, it's really fascinating. It's really fascinating to go back into this time period, which is further than we normally get to look at, and kind of see how everything was evolving. Because there can be an argument made that maybe if coin operated arcades never popularized the way they did, we may have never gotten to coin operated arcade cabinets as quickly as we did. And the industry may not have flourished the way it did, So I would
Yeah.
argue that even though this isn't a video game, it's still an important part of video game history because it inevitably led us to where we are today. So that's my takeaway.
No, it's definitely a good point. It's crazy to think. It's just interesting to think.
Yeah, this was a fun one. This was definitely a fun one. Well, they're all fun. They've been a lot. There have been a lot of fun ones lately. What am I talking about? There have been a lot of fun topics lately. So we've been doing solid. Uh, I I hate to ruin the illusion, ladies and gentlemen, but not every topic is a fun one. I know it's our podcast, and we get to pick what we do, but sometimes I want to tell a story because I think it'll be interesting, and then I find that it's not that interesting, but I have to make it a story anyways. So that's what I mean by that. You never know because I make every story interesting, right, Rob?
Oh, so interesting.
Anyway, been a lot of great topics lately. This one was a particularly interesting topic, so I told this a few weeks ago or last week's teaser. I've been excited to do this one for a while, so I've had this one laid out and written for almost a year now. So I was glad to finally get around to it. All right, Rob. Well, before I leave pinball behind and look forward to next week, is there anything that you'd like to add to today's episode?
I will take a quick moment to say thank you so much to all of our listeners. It means the world to us having you along as we learn about all of these different topics, from video games to consoles to things that aren't either, but just outlawed machines with a metal ball that goes in and out. So thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoy. And that's it. Back to you, Dave.
Well, that brings us to the end of our tilt free journey through the rich history of pinball, from its tabletop origins in the 18th century of France to its rise as a cultural icon, and even its brush, as Rob put it, with prohibition. Pinball has shown a remarkable ability to evolve and endure. Whether you're flipping for a high score or appreciating the artistry of the machines, the Silver Ball's legacy remains as captivating as ever. Next time you hear the buzz of an arcade, pinball's likely the game that started it all. Next week, though, we are expanding our quest into the world of Dragon Warrior 2. As the sequel to a genre defining classic, this RPG introduced party based combat, a larger world, and a tale of courage that inspired countless adventurers. So grab your sword, rally your allies, and join us for an epic journey on next week's trip down memory card lane. Do the thing.
Skibidi-dum-dum-dum-dum-doo.